How's it going? So, I think I've figured out how to make my videos a little bit more technological. Um, I think I've sorted out how I can record myself and re- show a recording of the actual YouTube video that I'm responding to so that we can sort of go through in steps. And what I wanted to do was obviously I'm responding to the morality circular reasoning video on the ecological atheist channel that I have, and preface that with my position is that I don't believe that there is an objective morality in and of itself. I don't think morality can appeal to any objective morals. I think it's all subjective. And I guess the reason that I brought the question up was to highlight the problem of appealing to objective standards. Now, I'll respond to what Ravi says, but I'll also afterwards give some extra reasoning as to why I think objective morality doesn't exist, which is sort of an indirect way of inferring that God also does not exist. Um, However, I don't know whether God does not exist or does exist. Um, I'm purely agnostic in that sense, but I'm atheist towards the claim that God exists. Anyways, so I'll start by playing the video now. It'll start at roughly about a minute, in which case I've already pitched the question about the circularity, so I won't include that in this video, but you can just, if you've watched the video before, you'll know my question. So I'll just start it and then I'll pause it and respond to what he says.
I don't think the argument is circular because circularity would be a self-referencing ethic for me. If I referred only to myself and I become the author of all that is good.
Okay, so he says, if it's a self-referencing ethic for me, I'm not entirely sure what he means with that. It sounds very much like a deepity, like he's saying something meaningful, but it doesn't actually mean anything. It's the reason it doesn't mean anything is because ethics is a part of morality. So, yeah, his comment doesn't. I'm not sure what to respond to or what to say to it because it doesn't entirely make sense. So I'll just carry on from that point.
But with God, who is infinite, who is uncaused, who is non-dependent, and in whom there is no contradiction, who is...
Yeah, it's a little bit annoying, this sort of format, because obviously Ravi has the stage to say whatever he likes, and he's listing off a long line of attributes, and of course. I don't think those attributes, those attributes in and of themselves, if you were to select them out and discuss how problematic those attributes actually are, if you were to actually try to think about how that would operate in reality. So yeah, he says a lot of these attributes, which would, of course, if they were indeed true, then yeah, the conclusion naturally follows, which is what Ravi says at the end. But and it's sort of the problem with, I guess the question is that, I guess it sort of hinges on, well, if God exists, therefore anything's possible, or that that morality is objective as possible, which of course is. That's why I'm bringing up the question, is because it's supposed to indirectly shed light on the incredibility of God existing. Anyways, we'll carry on. But the list of attributes that he's sort of that he's listing off there is, I can't and I don't respond to them because Yeah, I don't believe they've been demonstrated and that they can actually be demonstrated. Anyway, we'll carry on.
The creator of myself and this world. He created us with the design and the pattern to function within a certain law, and that purpose will be fulfilled in the sacredness of life.
I'm not sure what the purpose fulfilled in the sacredness of life means. This seems like another, a deepity, where he's saying something that sounds very profound and very meaningful, but when you actually sit down and go, okay, what does this actually mean? I'm sure if you sat down and spoke to Ravi and said to him, what do you actually mean with that statement? He would offer his view, but that view could change. It's very vague and very open to, you can make whatever meaning of it that you want. And I'm sure if you were to sit down, if you were to ask Ravi that same question or slightly worded differently on multiple different occasions, you would likely get multiple different answers because it's non-specific. Anyways, carry on.
So let me put it this way. If I take a car and use that to run over somebody, I can't blame the manufacturer of the car for doing that because that was not the purpose for which the car was made. And then I say to the manufacturer, yeah, but this is circular. You made the car and I'm using the car and now you're telling me I shouldn't use it for that purpose. You are the ultimate cause of it.
Ravi's analogy is flawed because in this instance, you can actually use the car to give an example of what the car is, and of course where it came from, and of course also directly what its intended purpose is. But it can be used to do a whole ton of different things. It doesn't necessarily have to be used for what its intended purpose is. I mean, I could use it as a storage device. But that's sort of beside the point. It's a bit irrelevant, and the analogy isn't correct as Ravi's putting it. A correct analogy would be something like having a car, and then inside the car it says, this is a car. And then a person goes, well, how do you know that that's a car? And then the response would be, well, it's because it says so inside the car. That is circular. And it doesn't tell you how you know that it's actually a car other than inside the car it says that it is. The point is that, and hence why I ask the question of the circularity, is how identifying how it is that you know that it is a car. Now, when it comes to a car, we can actually have examples of people making cars. We can reach a unanimous agreement on what the intended purpose for a car is, but that doesn't limit what it's capable of doing. But when it comes to morality, you can't necessarily use morality for anything else. And as I said, I don't believe there is an objective morality. So morality is in itself. It's a subjective thing. And the only reason that the objectivity side of it fails is, well, it's not the only reason, but it's a very strong point against it, is that claiming it's objective means you have to refer to itself for it to be, being able to identify good and bad, which would infer that good and bad come from somewhere outside of humans. And I don't believe that's the case. I believe good and bad are human constructs. Morality is a human construct. We define what is good and bad, and that is in accordance with the natural reality of the world. And I'll get into that afterwards, but I'll move on. The analogy of the car is not apt. It's not correct. Anyway, so I'll move on.
I don't think the argument would work, because God in his transcendence, in whom there is no contradiction, who created us for the sacred and for the purpose of vertical and horizontal relationships, built within us the structure and the law by which we may function and not self-destruct. If God were finite, the question would be valid. But God is an infinite, all-knowing being who has built into our psyche and our thinking the moral framework. So
he mentioned like an eternal, infinite being. Yeah, these are points that I don't even know what eternal or infinite is. I don't understand how anybody could know what that is. You know, what has somebody done to investigate and look into what eternity is? If you were presented with it, how would you know that it's eternal? I find a lot of these attributes, when people claim them, yes, they seem like a great idea, but anything beyond an idea is all it seems to be. I'm not quite gathering how we identify that, but that's sort of a side point.
So I do not think the argument becomes circular. The circular argument would be something where the conclusion is already in the assumption. That's what I see as circularity.
I will just point out that's exactly what I'm saying is circular, and that's exactly what's going on. I'll lay it out again. Ravi says that we have an objective moral framework, that in that objective moral framework we can identify what is good and bad. Now, if that objective moral framework comes from God, then it's circular to use that to then confirm that God is good. And how do you also know that the framework that you're using is actually a framework that allows us, or that the framework itself is actually a good framework? It's an actual moral framework rather than immoral framework. That is exactly what is circular. You're appealing, at least it would seem you're appealing to say that the moral framework that we have is a good moral framework. And then how do you know that it's good? Well, you're appealing to that framework to conclude that the moral framework itself is good. That is the very definition of a circular argument.
And this is not a circular argument in terms of philosophical definition of circularity. You assume the conclusion in the assumption. That's what a circular argument is.
That's exactly what's happening. The moral framework that we have is good and allows us to identify good as well as evil. So, assumingly, which this is what most Christians believe, is that God is good, humans are good, and we're using that framework to identify those very things. That's circular.
And this is not a circular argument. This is just telling you, defending for you that God is the creator of the universe, and in that creator, he gives us the patterns by which we may live. That is not a circular argument. That is a transcendent demonstration of that which is objectively true. It does not borrow.
Again, yeah, this refers back to that morality is objective, which, yeah, I really don't believe it is. And once this is finished, I'll talk about why I don't think it is.
From the circular argument, give to me a definition of what a circular argument is.
Where the premises hinge in the conclusion.
That is correct. And what is the conclusion in the premise here?
That the moral law that you have is good. That the moral law that you've been given to identify good and bad is given by God. That moral law is good. So you're getting a moral framework, using that to identify
okay.
good and evil.
If you take just the aspect of goodness, but not the moral law itself. The moral law is objective. And when we say it is good, we mean there is no self-destruction capacity in God.
That is sort of redefining good. No definition that I know of good defines it as no self-destruction capacity. Yeah, I'm not sure how you would confirm that. Even if it is the case, I don't know how you investigate or prove that that's even true. But anyway, we'll let that slide.
The opposite of good is evil, which is destructive. God cannot cease to be.
How are you identifying that?
How do I what?
How are you identifying that if the frame...
So you're asking me how I identify God?
No.
So one thing I just want to add here is that taking for granted that if morality is objective, that objective framework allows us to identify what is good and evil. Would I not then be justified in asserting that God is just as evil as he is bad? Just as evil as he is good. Even if we do accept the idea that evil is self-destructive. If you've got 50-50, then, you should assume that the good outweighs or at least balances the bad and that you won't self-destruct. Just an idea.
Good and evil is based on that moral framework.
Right.
Which you're saying comes from God.
Yes.
And you're using that framework to identify that the framework itself is good and not evil.
No, I'm not using that framework. I'm using the premise to tell you that there is no self-destruction in God. But God, by definition, cannot cease to be.
So is that a moral judgment outside of...
No, that's not a moral judgment. That's a propositional statement of an infinite being. It's not a moral judgment.
You mean it's a presupposition?
Sorry?
You're presupposing.
It's not a presupposition. It's built into the definition of an infinite being whom we call God.
And God is who you're presupposing.
Sorry?
But you're presupposing that God exists.
That's what I'm saying to you. The question hangs on the existence of God. So your question is really different to what you're proposing on the goodness and evil of God.
That's because I'm letting the presupposition slide
Yeah,
in order.
that's right. So the question has to be raised, how do we know God exists?
Yeah, but
All right.
I'm just letting
All
that
right.
go.
Okay. So you're granting that if God exists, then the premise, then the conclusion will naturally follow. So that's what I'm saying to you.
Okay. So in conclusion, the problem is that Ravi is right to some extent that much of what we're discussing hinges on whether God exists or not. But even granting, which is why I asked the question, even granting that if God exists, there's still that inherent circularity in asserting that there's objective morality. Because like I said, you have to reference the moral framework itself, which you've identified as a good moral framework, that it comes from God, which is who you're also identifying as good, to confirm that. It is circular. And that is problematic. And the reason why, obviously my position is that as an agnostic atheist is that I don't believe in the claim that God exists. And I do hold the position that I don't believe God exists. I don't know if he exists or not. I just don't believe he does. And I try to make sense of the world, and I try to make sense of things under the idea that if God doesn't exist, then, under the definitions that we understand of the Christian God, including in that the idea of objective morality, then how do we make sense of the world? So I don't believe there's an objective morality, which makes sense because I don't believe that God exists. So therefore, the idea that we have an objective moral framework also doesn't follow. And that is indeed what we actually see within reality. If you take absolutely any moral sentiment that people would claim would be objective, one of the 10 commandments, thou shalt not steal, for example, or, thou shalt not murder. These are inherently humanly subjective. The idea of murder is unlawfully taking the life of another person. When it's humans that dictate the laws that fulfill the criteria for killing someone unlawfully, or the idea of thou shalt not steal. I could give you 100 examples of where a situation where the idea of stealing would be acceptable. And again, the criteria by which we consider something to be stolen is again dictated by humans. Now, I believe, like I've said many times now, is that morality is simply subjective. Humans dictate, we define good and evil, we define good and bad. Evil is sort of more it has ties that bind with religious ideology, so I just tend to use good and bad. And we do. We identify actions that are good and bad. And we do that through a rational consideration for the effects that our actions have on other people. Now, a question that is often pitched is, what is the framework? Where do you get your morality from? And, excuse me, our morality comes from the brute fact that basically all living things that we see, and this is, I'm not saying, what I'm about to say is not, this is not explaining the sheer complexity and that it explains in the entirety of, morality today as we know it, but it provides an explanation for what is a basic framework from which that we can build upon a moral framework in accordance with brute facts. So brute facts are things like all living things that we know generally prefer to continue living or strive to continue living than preferring to die or striving to die. Now, assuming that both either way of those types of existing in reality, that, if something wanted to persist living, that it would do its best and act upon persisting to live, in the same fashion that if something genuinely wanted to die, that it would go out and do its best that it could to go and die. That explains why, you are watching this video, I'm talking about this, we have people here, that are listening, you interact with people every day, you see many living things because they're all striving to live and continue living. Again, that's not objectively true because there are exceptions to that rule as well. Someone that is terminally ill, or an animal that is that is suffering from some sort of ailment, or, is also terminally ill. Often there would be a preference to die. If you are not going to get better and your days are going to just, whatever days you have left are just going to be suffering and, needless amounts of excruciating pain, there would be an argument where, if you could make a decision, that a person would likely say, I would prefer not to live if that's the case, which is why we have the debate around euthanasia. The other part to a brute fact is that most, at least things that we can identify as having some sort of sentience, would prefer to live in their striving to live in pleasure over, say, suffering. There's and again, not objectively true, but generally, living things aren't setting out to pursue suffering or live in suffering or, want to actively suffer. Living things tend to seek out having enough food, having enough water, being warm or being in comfortable environmental conditions to what that organism has evolved to, and so on. That is a brute fact, and it is those two brute facts that we can look at and we can identify in lesser complex animals as we look throughout the complexity of the animal kingdom, that you see actual rudimentary foundations of moral sentiments. You can see where the evolutionary foundations are for morality that we know it today. And of course, humans, which we would arguably assert are the most intellectually advanced of the animal species, have been able to advance and expand upon the idea of morality or things that we class as moral as our existence, interacting with other human beings and other animals, become more complex through the advancing of our intellectual capacity. But if you look back over the animal kingdom, like I mentioned, and you look at less complex animals, less intellectually complex animals, such as wolves and so on, you can see very basic foundations of what we would identify as basic moral foundations. Wolves are clearly not going around mauling their own family to bits because there's no objective moral framework that they're following. They clearly pull rear young, they protect their young and relatives from predators or competing species. They share the food. There's many elements where you can look at it and go, well, they're looking out for one another. When you see a mother with its cubs, it's grooming them, looking after them. The cubs are playing with them. You can identify so many different aspects of what we can make moral conclusions of specific behaviors that they make. And of course, this all doesn't really fit in with a biblical narrative because there's no mention of morality or systems of moral frameworks for animals. It's very anthropogenically focused. The whole, which makes sense. My suspicion is that religion in general, but in this case, because Ravi's a Christian, that that Christianity is just a product of man-made fabrication, just like, as I say, with basically all religions. And that, of course, makes sense. There's whatever the country that Christianity originated from is, of course, the focus of much of the stories that originate from it. Makes sense that the Israelites are the chosen people because it originated from there. Anyways, that's sort of digressing. But yeah, so the whole point, and in summary, the whole point of me asking that question is because I don't believe there is objective morality, and that's because I don't believe that God exists. And of course, the claim is that objective morality comes from God. So my raising the question is highlighting an inconsistency, or at least a logical fallacy, in appealing to the claim that there is objective morality. I'm by no means a master in morality at all. These are purely my thoughts on the matter. I have done some rudimentary reading, and I'm very, very keen to hear what other people's thoughts are. If there's a problem in my reasoning or something that I've said that's false, please let me know. Anything that I can, better myself on, because I don't know everything. So if I can learn something new, then that's an improvement to be made. I'll leave it there. Thank you for your time. And yeah, if you have any comments or any feedback, please please let me know. I'd look forward to them. Thank you.